The heavy wooden doors of the downtown courtroom swung shut with a dull thud, cutting off the noise of the busy city hallway outside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled strongly of old paper, floor wax, and the lingering scent of stale coffee. It was a Tuesday morning, which meant the schedule was packed with small cases, minor disputes, and people who were hoping their problems would disappear quickly. At the front of the room, sitting high above everyone else on a raised platform, was the judge. He was an older man who had been wearing the black robe for 30 years. He had seen everything, or at least he thought he had. He was tired, he was hungry, and he was in no mood for nonsense. The courtroom was slowly filling up. People shuffled in, finding seats on the hard wooden benches. There were tired mothers holding the hands of toddlers, businessmen checking their expensive watches, and a few nervous individuals waiting for their names to be called. The prosecutor's table was occupied by a man in a sharp gray suit who was typing furiously on his laptop. He looked confident, like he usually did, because today he was dealing with what he thought was a very simple open and shut case. When the bailiff called out the next case, a hush fell over the room. The name of the defendant was announced, but nobody stood up at first. Then, the door near the back opened, and a young girl walked in. She looked like she should have been in a high school geometry class, not in a court of law. She looked to be about 16 years old. She wasn't wearing a designer suit or a uniform. Instead, she wore a simple blue blazer that looked a little too big for her frame, paired with neat slacks and plain black shoes. She carried a heavy-looking canvas bag over her shoulder, the kind students use for textbooks. As she walked down the center aisle toward the front, heads turned. The prosecutor stopped typing and looked over his glasses, his eyebrows shooting up in confusion. He leaned toward the police officer standing nearby and whispered something, likely asking where the lawyer was. The girl didn't look left or right. She kept her eyes forward, her expression calm and focused, ignoring the whispers of the crowd. She walked past the prosecution table and sat down at the defendant's chair. She didn't look for a parent or a guardian. She simply opened her bag, pulled out a yellow legal pad and a few sharpened pencils, and placed them neatly on the desk. The judge looked down from his bench, peering over his spectacles. He cleared his throat loudly, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He looked around the waiting area near the doors. "Are we waiting for counsel?" the judge asked, his voice grumpy and impatient. "I don't have all day." "Where is the representative for the defendant?" The girl stood up. She straightened her blazer and looked directly at the judge. "I am representing myself, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was clear, though it had the soft tone of a teenager. The judge stared at her. He blinked a few times, as if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He looked at the prosecutor, who shrugged his shoulders. The judge looked back at the girl, a small frown forming on his face. "Young lady," the judge said, leaning forward, "this is a court of law. This is not a playground. We are dealing with serious municipal codes and potential fines. Is your mother or father here? Is there a guardian present?" "No, Your Honor," the girl replied politely but firmly. "I am 17 years old. In this state, that permits me to represent myself in this matter." A few low chuckles rippled through the audience. A man in the back row shook his head. It seemed ridiculous to everyone in the room. The idea that a high school student, a girl who probably had homework to do later, thought she could stand up to a trained prosecutor and a veteran judge was amusing to them. They expected the judge to scold her and send her away to get a real lawyer. The judge sighed, a long weary sound that showed his frustration. He picked up a pen and tapped it against his desk. "Look," he said, his tone shifting from grumpy to stern. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, really I do. But the legal system is complicated. We have rules of evidence, rules of procedure, and statutes that take years to understand. You cannot just walk in here with a notebook and expect to argue this case. It is disrespectful to the court and to the process." "I have studied the statutes, Your Honor," the girl interrupted gently. "I believe I am prepared." The prosecutor stood up. He smoothed his tie and gave the judge a sympathetic look. "Your Honor, perhaps we can take a short recess. I assume the defendant is just confused. Maybe she needs time to realize that she needs professional help." He smiled at the girl, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile a predator gives to prey that doesn't know it's in danger yet. The judge shook his head. No, we will proceed. I am not going to waste the court's time waiting for a reality check. He pointed his pen at the girl. I am warning you. If you start speaking nonsense, or if you delay these proceedings, I will hold you in contempt. I will find you guilty just for wasting our time. Do you understand? The girl nodded. I understand, Your Honor, but I believe the facts will show that the citation is invalid. Facts? The judge laughed sarcastically. I haven't even heard the facts yet. But I can already see where this is going. He looked at the paperwork in front of him. You are charged with a zoning violation regarding a structure on private property. This is a complex code issue. What could you possibly know about zoning laws? I know that the code in question conflicts with the state definition of private property usage. She answered immediately. The judge rolled his eyes. He leaned back in his big leather chair and crossed his arms. Okay, that's enough. I have heard enough legal jargon from television shows. I am going to give you one last chance to step aside and let an adult handle this, or we are going to do this the hard way. The tension in the room shifted. The laughter in the gallery died down. People watched the girl, waiting to see if she would cry or if she would back down. The prosecutor looked bored, already thinking about his lunch break. But the girl didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands resting calmly on her legal pad. She looked the judge in the eye, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, terrifying confidence. I am ready to proceed, Your Honor, she said simply. The judge let out a huff of disbelief. He waved his hand dismissively. Fine, Mr. Prosecutor, let's get this over with. But let the record show that the defendant has been warned. The prosecutor smiled and stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't see the girl as a threat. He saw her as a speed bump, a funny little distraction in his day. He began to read from his file, listing the complaints, the dates, and the specific codes that the girl had allegedly broken. He used big words and complicated sentences, trying to confuse her. He expected her to look down at her shoes, to look panicked, to ask him to repeat what he said. Instead, as he spoke, the girl began to write. She didn't write frantically. She wrote slowly and methodically. Every time the prosecutor stated a law number, she circled it on her pad. Every time he mentioned a date, she underlined it. She was preparing for something. The room was filled with the sound of the prosecutor's voice droning on, but the girl's focus was intense. She was barely a blur in the chair, a teenager lost in a world of giants, yet she held the room's attention without saying a word. The judge watched her, his impatience growing like a storm cloud, thinking he was about to teach a child a lesson. He had no idea that the lesson was about to be his. The prosecutor continued to drone on, his voice filling the room with a monotonous hum. He was listing dates, times, and specific measurements of offense that was supposedly too high. He walked back and forth in front of the judge's bench, confident and smooth, turning to face the gallery every now and then as if he were performing on a stage. He spoke fast, using long, complicated words that he thought made him sound smarter. He was reading from a prepared script, barely glancing at the girl sitting alone at the defense table. When he finally finished, sat down with a satisfied sigh, straightening his tie. The judge looked down at the girl over the rim of his glasses. He tapped his pen on the wood again, a rhythmic, impatient sound. Okay, the judge said, his voice gruff. Mr. Prosecutor has made it very clear what happened. Now, young lady, it is your turn. You are allowed to tell me why you think you are innocent. But please, let's keep it short. I don't need a long speech about your feelings. I just want to know if you have anything relevant to say. The girl stood up. She smoothed the front of her blazer with one hand and picked up her legal pad with the other. She looked up at the judge. The courtroom was silent. Everyone was watching her. They were waiting for her to stutter, to cry, or to make a mistake. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady. I appreciate the time to speak. While the prosecution has given a timeline of events, they have failed to mention Section 4C of the Municipal Code. This section specifically states that structures built before the 1985 zoning update are exempt from the current height restrictions. She paused for a second, glancing down at her notes. My property was surveyed last week by a licensed inspector, and the deed confirms the original structure dates back to 1982. Therefore, the citation regarding the fence height is invalid. Under the grandfather clause currently in effect, the room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioner humming in the ceiling. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, looking confused. A few people in the gallery looked at each other with raised eyebrows. She hadn't talked about how nice the fence looked or how hard she had worked on it. She hadn't given an emotional excuse. She had cited a specific law down to the letter and number. The judge, however, did not look impressed. He narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, interlacing his fingers. "Young lady," he said slowly, "did you just try to quote a statute to me?" "Yes, Your Honor. It is the relevant statute," the girl replied. "I have been sitting on this bench longer than you have been alive," the judge snapped. "I know what is relevant and what is not. I don't appreciate a child looking up legal terms on the internet and thinking she can teach me about municipal code. I didn't look it up on the internet." "Your Honor, I read it in the county law library," she said calmly. "I don't care where you read it," the judge shouted, his face turning a little red. "This is my courtroom, and I don't have time for Wikipedia law. Do you think this is a game? Do you think you can just rattle off a few fancy words and I will let you go? This is disrespectful. It is disrespectful to the prosecutor. It is disrespectful to the officers who issued the ticket, and it is disrespectful to me." The girl didn't look down. She didn't look scared. She just stood there, gripping her notebook, waiting for him to finish. "I see teenagers in here all the time," the judge continued, waving his hand dismissively. "They steal cars, they vandalize property, and they always have an excuse. But you think you are smart? You think you are a lawyer? Let me tell you something. It takes years of school to understand the law. It takes passing a difficult exam. You can't just waltz in here with a notebook and act like you know everything. You are making a fool of yourself." The people in the gallery started to whisper again. It was uncomfortable now. The judge was angry. He was being mean. He was insulting her, not just her argument, but her intelligence and her age. He wasn't acting like a fair judge anymore. He was acting like a bully who was annoyed that the little kid wasn't backing down. The girl took a deep breath. She looked at the judge with a gaze that was surprisingly intense. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through his rant, "with all due respect, I am not trying to be disrespectful. I am trying to follow the rules of this court. I am simply pointing out that the prosecution's evidence does not support the charge because of the exemption law." "I have heard enough from you," the judge barked. "I am done listening to your little speech. You are not a lawyer. You are a high school student who is in way over her head. And if you don't stop wasting my time with this nonsense, I am going to find you in contempt of court. I can put you in a holding cell until you learn some manners. Do you understand that?" The prosecutor looked down at his papers, pretending to be busy. He didn't want to get involved. He was happy to let the judge do the dirty work. The bailiff standing near the door shifted his weight, looking uneasy. Even he could see that the judge was going too far, but nobody dared to interrupt him. The girl looked at the judge. She didn't blink. She didn't shake. She just stood there, looking at him like she was analyzing a problem in a math book. It was an eerie moment. Most adults would have been terrified by now. Most people would have apologized and sat down, but she stood her ground. "I understand the threat, Your Honor," she said quietly, "but I cannot sit down while my rights are being violated. I have not broken any law, and quoting the actual law of this state is not a waste of time. It is the reason we are here." The judge slammed his hand down on the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the room. Several people in the gallery jumped. "That is it," the judge yelled. "I have warned you twice. You want to play lawyer? You want to pretend you know better than the court? Fine. I am entering a plea of guilty on your behalf. I am not going to listen to any more of this. I am going to fine you the maximum amount allowed by law. I am going to add court costs to teach you a lesson about respect. Maybe spending your summer paying off this fine will help you understand that the real world doesn't care about your internet research. He picked up his pen, ready to sign the paper that would end her life and punish her for daring to stand up to him. The prosecutor smirked. It was over. They had won. The big, powerful adults had crushed the teenager who tried to fight back. The judge looked at the girl, expecting tears. He expected her to collapse under the weight of his authority. But she didn't move. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a thick, heavy book. It was bound in black leather, and the pages looked worn and yellowed, like it had been read 1,000 times. She placed it on the table in front of her. The judge paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He looked at the book. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A dictionary? A comic book? Put it away. I have already made my ruling." "It is the state code book, Your Honor," she said. She opened it, flipping through the pages quickly, her fingers finding the exact spot she was looking for. "And before you sign that judgment, there is something you need to see. Something that relates directly to a ruling you made 3 years ago." The judge scoffed. "I made a lot of rulings 3 years ago. I make a lot of rulings every day. I don't need a history lesson. You might want to check this one," the girl said, her voice suddenly dropping an octave. It wasn't the voice of a teenager anymore. It was the voice of someone holding a royal flush. "Because if you sign that paper, you will be contradicting your own precedent. And that would be a very embarrassing mistake for someone with your experience." The room went dead silent. The air seemed to leave the room. The judge stopped writing. The prosecutor lifted his head. The bailiff stepped forward. Everyone realized at that exact second that the dynamic in the room had just shifted. The girl wasn't fighting to stay out of trouble anymore. She was setting a trap, and the judge had just walked right into it. The judge held his pen in midair, hovering just inches above the judgment paper. He looked at the girl, then down at the thick black book she had placed on the table. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The silence that filled the room was heavy, the kind that makes your ears ring. The earlier noise of shuffling feet and clearing throats was gone. Everyone was holding their breath. "I am going to say this one last time," the judge said, his voice low and dangerous. "Put the book away. I have made my decision. This hearing is over. You are found guilty. Now, sit down before I have the bailiff remove you." The girl didn't move. She didn't sit down, and she didn't put the book away. Instead, she looked up at the judge with a steady gaze that was almost unnerving. It was the look of a chess player who knows the game is already won, even if the other player hasn't realized it yet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the tension. "I understand you wish to end this quickly, but you cannot legally enter a guilty plea against a defendant who is contesting the evidence. Not in this court, and not under the statutes you swore to uphold." The prosecutor stood up quickly, knocking his chair back. "Your Honor, she is interrupting the process. This is ridiculous. She is clearly trying to delay the inevitable. I request that you impose the maximum sentence for contempt immediately." The judge ignored the prosecutor for a moment. He stared hard at the girl, trying to intimidate her with his eyes. It was a look that had made grown men sweat and lawyers tremble. But the girl just looked back at him, her face calm. She wasn't sweating. She wasn't trembling. She looked like she was waiting for a bus. "Little girl," the judge said, leaning over the bench, "do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do to you? I can ruin your day. I can make sure you have a record that follows you for the rest of your life. I am giving you a chance to walk out of here with just a fine. Do not throw that away because you think you know something." "I am not throwing anything away, Your Honor," she replied softly. "I am trying to save you from a reversible error. An error that would not only embarrass this court, but could cost the city a significant amount of money in civil damages if you proceed with this ruling." A low murmur went through the crowd. People gasped. She was threatening the court? She was talking about civil damages? The prosecutor looked confused, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at the judge, waiting for him to explode. "What are you talking about?" The judge snapped. "Civil damages? What, money? This is a zoning violation." "It is about the property rights, Your Honor," the girl said. She opened the black book, turning the pages with practiced ease. She didn't search for the page. She knew exactly where it was. She stopped and turned the book around to face the bench, pointing to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. Section 14B of the State Municipal Code, she read aloud. It clearly states that any structure existing prior to the zoning update of 1985 is legally recognized as a grandfathered, non-conforming use. The prosecution has provided no evidence that my fence was built after that date. Furthermore, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution to show that the structure is new, not with me to show that it is old. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then, she looked the judge right in the eye. And as for the contempt threat, there is a ruling from the state Supreme Court, specifically the 2019 case of Davidson v. The city Square. A judge was reprimanded for suppressing a defendant's right to present evidence based on statute. You presided over that case, Your Honor? You wrote the opinion yourself. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The judge froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and gray. He stared at the girl, his mouth slightly open. He looked down at his desk, as if he expected to see his old notes from that case sitting there. The prosecutor whipped his head around to look at the judge, his eyes wide with shock. The name of the case sounded familiar. Davidson v. The city. It was a famous local case. Everyone knew about it. And the judge in this room had indeed been the one to make the ruling. The judge cleared his throat. But this time it wasn't a sound of authority. It was a nervous, dry cough. He pulled at his collar, which suddenly seemed too tight. I don't recall the specific details of that case right now, he stammered. It was a Tuesday, just like today, the girl said, her voice almost sympathetic. You ruled that the court could not ignore the written statute in favor of verbal arguments from the prosecution. You said, and I quote, "The law is the law, regardless of who stands before the bench. You were right then, Your Honor. You are right now." The prosecutor sank back into his seat. He looked defeated. He realized that he had walked into a trap. He had assumed the girl was uneducated and easy to beat. He hadn't checked the old property records. He hadn't checked the grandfather clauses. He had just assumed a teenager couldn't know more than him. And now the judge was cornered. If he found her guilty now, he was going against his own famous ruling. He would be a hypocrite in front of everyone. The judge looked around the courtroom. The bailiff was standing very still, listening closely. The people in the gallery were wide awake, leaning forward in their seats. They all knew something had changed. The bully was no longer in charge. The smartest person in the room was the 17-year-old girl in the oversized blazer. The judge picked up the citation paper. He looked at it, then at the girl. His hand was shaking slightly. He tried to regain his composure, straightening his back and clearing his throat again, but the power was gone. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. He wanted to punish her for embarrassing him, but he knew he couldn't. She had beaten him. She had used his own rules against him, and she had done it without raising her voice. This is highly irregular, the judge muttered, more to himself than to the court. You are citing Supreme Court rulings in a zoning hearing? The law is the law, Your Honor, the girl repeated gently, echoing his own words back to him. It applies to everyone. Even to me. The judge sat there for a long moment. He looked at the black book on the table. He looked at the yellow legal pad filled with her neat handwriting. He finally understood that this wasn't a game. This wasn't a kid playing dress-up. This was a legal genius who had come prepared to fight for her rights, and she had just checked him in front of everyone he knew. He realized that he was the one who was about to make a mistake that could end up in the newspapers or on the evening news. Judge Bully's teen prodigy. He slowly put his pen down on the desk. He didn't sign the paper, well, the judge said, his voice lacking all of its earlier confidence. It seems we may need to review the evidence more thoroughly. I cannot proceed with a guilty plea if the evidence of the date of construction is in dispute. He took a deep breath, trying to find a way out that would save some face. Mr. Prosecutor, do you have the survey reports? Do you have the proof of when the fence was built? The prosecutor looked at his file. He flipped through it frantically, his face turning red. I have the complaint from the neighbor, Your Honor. but I do not have a survey report. I assumed the fence was new. You assumed? The judge snapped, turning his anger toward the prosecutor now. You came into my court and asked for a judgment based on an assumption? The prosecutor looked down at his shoes. Yes, Your Honor. The judge turned back to the girl. He looked defeated. He looked like an old man who is just tired of fighting a losing battle. He couldn't win. She had boxed him in perfectly. There was no way out, except to let her go. Okay, the judge said, sighing deeply. Okay, the motion for a guilty verdict is denied. The case is continued until the prosecution can provide actual evidence regarding the age of the structure. He banged his gavel, but it was a weak sound. Just a dull tap. The girl closed her book. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She simply picked up her bag and nodded respectfully to the judge. Thank you, Your Honor, for upholding the law. She turned and walked back down the aisle. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. They just watched her go with a mixture of awe and fear. She had walked in alone, and she had taken down the system. As she pushed the heavy doors open and stepped back out into the hallway, the silence in the courtroom remained. The judge sat on his bench, staring at the spot where she had been standing, wondering how he had just lost an argument to a high school student. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't just a quiet moment. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed down on everyone's shoulders. The judge sat frozen, his hand hovering over the paperwork he had been ready to sign just moments ago. His face, which had been red and angry a minute earlier, was now pale. The color had drained out of it so quickly that he looked like he had seen a ghost. The bailiff, usually a statue of a man, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Looking nervously between the judge and the teenage girl, she stood there, calm as could be, her hand resting on the open page of the heavy black book. The contrast between the two was striking. On one side, there was the most powerful man in the room, a man who had spent 30 years dispensing justice, now looking cornered and small. On the other side, there was a girl in an oversized blazer, a girl who wasn't even old enough to vote. Holding all the cards, the judge cleared his throat, but the sound was weak and scratchy. He tried to regain his composure, smoothing his robe and straightening his papers, but his hands were shaking slightly. He looked at the book on the table, then back at the girl. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. She had quoted a specific case, a case he had presided over years ago, and she had used his own words against him. It was a brilliant move, a checkmate in a game he hadn't even realized they were playing. I recall the case, the judge stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat again, trying to sound authoritative, but the confidence was gone. The Davidson ruling? Yes, I remember it. Then you know. Your Honor, the girl said softly, that in that ruling, you specifically stated that a judge cannot ignore a written statute just because they believe the defendant is. What was the phrase you used? Too inexperienced to understand the gravity of the situation. She said the words without cruelty. She wasn't mocking him. She was simply stating the facts. But to the people watching, it felt like a lightning bolt. She was quoting the judge back to himself, using his own past wisdom to stop him from making a mistake in the present. It was a masterclass in legal strategy, and she was doing it without raising her voice. The prosecutor, who had been so smug and confident just 10 minutes ago, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He was flipping wildly through his file, his face turning a deep shade of red. He was looking for a way out, a piece of paper, a law, anything that could save him. But there was nothing. He had relied on the judge's impatience to win the case. He had assumed the girl would be bullied into a guilty plea. Now, the judge was angry, but he wasn't angry at the girl anymore. He was angry at the prosecutor for putting him in this position. Mr. Prosecutor, the judge snapped, turning his glare away from the girl and toward the other lawyer. Did you verify the age of the structure before filing these charges? Did you check the property records? The prosecutor stood up, knocking his knee against the desk. Well, Your Honor, we went off the complaint. The neighbor said it was a new fence. We assumed? You assumed? The judge interrupted, his voice rising. You came into my courtroom. You took up the court's time, and you asked me to punish a citizen based on an assumption. Did you not look at Section 14B? Did you not check the zoning maps? No, Your Honor, the prosecutor mumbled, looking down at his shoes. I thought it was a straightforward violation. The judge let out a long, frustrated sigh. He rubbed his temples with his fingertips. He looked tired. He looked like a man who realized he had just dodged a bullet. But only because the person holding the gun decided not to pull the trigger. If he had signed that guilty plea, if he had ignored the girl's argument, it would have been overturned on appeal. The newspapers would have had a field day. Judge ignores his own ruling to bully teenager. It would have been a disaster. He knew it. The prosecutor knew it, and now the whole courtroom knew it. The girl closed the black book with a soft thud. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look like she enjoyed watching the grown men squirm. She looked like she was just glad the truth was finally out. She picked up her bag and looked at the judge, waiting for his final word. Honor, she said, breaking the silence. I know I am young, and I know I don't have a fancy degree on my wall yet. But the law isn't about age. It's about the truth. And the truth is, I didn't do anything wrong. My fence was there long before the new rules. All I wanted was a fair hearing. I believe that is what this court promises to everyone. The judge looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the preparation she had done. He saw the hours she must have spent in the library, reading books that were probably older than she was. He realized that he had judged her by her cover, and he had been dead wrong. She had more respect for the law in her little finger than he had shown in his last hour of impatience. You are correct, the judge said, his voice heavy. This court promises a fair hearing to everyone, and I failed to provide that to you today. I allowed my preconceived notions about your age to cloud my judgment. For that, I owe you an apology. A gasp went through the gallery. The bailiff's head snapped up. The prosecutor's jaw dropped. A judge apologizing? In open court? It was almost unheard of. It was a humbling moment, a rare crack in the armor of the legal system where humanity finally broke through. I apologize, the judge continued, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. I mocked your knowledge. I tried to silence you, and you were right. You were absolutely right. The law is the law, and I should have listened to you sooner. The girl smiled then. It was a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She gave a slight nod. Thank you, Your Honor. I accept your apology. The judge picked up his pen again, but this time he used it to scratch out the guilty plea he had started to write. He picked up a fresh piece of paper. In light of the new evidence presented by the defense, specifically the citation of Section 14B and the Davidson precedent, I am dismissing the case with prejudice. He looked at the prosecutor, and I suggest you go back to your office and do your homework properly before you drag another citizen into this courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, the prosecutor whispered, humiliated. He quickly gathered his things, shoving papers into his briefcase with trembling hands. He didn't look at the girl. He just wanted to disappear. The judge looked back at the girl. Is there anything else you would like to say? No, Your Honor, she said. That is all I needed. Then you are free to go, the judge said. He banged his gavel, but it wasn't a loud, aggressive sound this time. It was a final, decisive tap that signaled the end of the battle. The girl didn't rush away. She took her time packing her bag. She put her yellow legal pad inside, then her pencils, and finally, the heavy black code book. She zipped the bag shut and put it over her shoulder. As she turned to walk away, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The people in the gallery weren't looking at her with amusement anymore. They were looking at her with respect. As she walked down the center aisle toward the double doors, people started to clap. It started with one person, an older man sitting in the back row. Then a woman near the front joined in. Within seconds, the whole room was erupting in applause. It wasn't polite golf clapping. It was loud, raucous, cheering. People stood up. A man gave her a thumbs up as she passed. The bailiff, standing by the door, actually tipped his hat to her as she walked by. The girl didn't soak in the applause. She didn't bow or wave. She just walked with her head high, a small smile on her face. walking out of the room the same way she had walked in, calm, collected, and entirely herself. The judge sat at his bench, listening to the applause fade as the doors closed behind her. He sat there for a long time, looking at the empty chair where the girl had been sitting. He felt a strange mix of emotions. He felt foolish, yes. He felt embarrassed that a teenager had outsmarted him. But mostly, he felt something else. He felt inspired. In a world full of people who lied and cheated and cut corners, he had just watched a young person fight for the truth with everything she had, simply because it was the right thing to do. He looked down at the book on his desk, the rule book he had memorized decades ago. He realized that today, he hadn't just judged a case. He had been judged too, and he had learned a lesson that he would remember for the rest of his life. Never underestimate the person standing in front of you, no matter how small they might seem. The bailiff walked over to the judge's desk. "Do you need anything, Your Honor?" he asked quietly. The judge looked up, startled out of his thoughts. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "No, I just need a minute." He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, the long, heavy breath of a man who had just survived a storm. Outside, in the hallway, he could hear the faint echo of the crowd still cheering for the girl who had beaten the system. He smiled just a little bit and closed his eyes. It was a Tuesday morning, and he had been defeated by a genius. And strangely, it felt okay. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing off the noise of the cheering crowd inside. Out in the hallway, the air felt cooler and cleaner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the drama that had just unfolded. The girl walked at a steady pace, her canvas bag bumping lightly against her hip. She wasn't running away, but she wasn't dragging her feet either. She just walked with a purpose, heading toward the exit. Behind her, the noise inside the courtroom had died down to a hum, but the energy was still high. People were pouring out of the double doors, their voices overlapping in a rush of excitement. It wasn't every day that they saw a real-life David versus Goliath story, especially one where David won so convincingly. "Wait up," a voice called out. The girl stopped and turned around. A young man, probably a law student based on the thick textbooks he was carrying, was jogging toward her. He looked breathless, his eyes wide with excitement. "That was incredible," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I've never seen anything like that. You cited the Davidson case from memory? And you quoted the page number?" The girl adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and offered a shy, modest smile. "I didn't have it all memorized," she said softly. "I just knew it was in section 14. I had the page numbers flagged in my notes." "You destroyed him," the student whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. That prosecutor looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "And the judge. I thought he was going to explode, but you made him apologize." "I don't think he's apologized to anyone in 10 years. He just made a mistake," the girl said, her tone lacking any bitterness. "He was in a rush. He assumed I didn't know what I was doing because of how I look. I think he learned something today, just like I did." The student laughed, a short, amazed sound. "Well, you definitely taught him. I'm going to be a lawyer one day, and I hope I can be half that prepared. Seriously, what's your name? You're going to be famous." "I'm just glad I can keep my fence," she said, avoiding the question about her name. "Good luck with law school. Remember to read the statutes." She gave a small wave and turned back toward the main exit. The student stood there watching her go, likely trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just that she had won. It was how she had won. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't insulted anyone, and she hadn't begged for mercy. She had simply used the truth as a shield and a sword as she pushed through the glass doors of the courthouse. The bright afternoon sun hit her face. The city noise rushed, in cars honking, sirens wailing, people talking on their phones. It was the same world she had left that morning, but she felt different. She felt lighter. The weight of the fine, the threat of contempt, and the fear of losing her home had all vanished in a matter of minutes. She sat down on a concrete bench near the fountain in the courthouse plaza to take a breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. There were a few text messages from friends asking where she was, and one from her mom asking if the hearing went okay. She smiled as she typed a reply, asterisk, it went great. I'll tell you everything when I get home, asterisk, while her phone was in her hand. It started to vibrate constantly with notifications. She looked at the screen and saw that social media was already blowing up. Someone in the courtroom must have recorded the climax of the argument. The video was already being shared, tagged with captions like "Genius Teen Destroys Judge" and "She Owned the Court." She watched a few seconds of the clip, seeing herself standing tall while the judge stammered. It felt strange, watching her own quiet moment of defiance become a public spectacle. She didn't want to be an internet star. She just wanted the city to leave her and her property alone. She put the phone back into her pocket without posting anything. Let the world talk. She had other things to think about, like calculus homework and what to make for dinner, and the fact that she didn't have to pay a fine she couldn't afford inside the building. High up in the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was much heavier. The judge sat in his leather chair, looking out the window at the city below. He could see the girl sitting on the bench, down by the fountain. From this height, she looked even smaller, just a tiny speck on the concrete. His desk was cluttered with files, but he wasn't looking at them. He was thinking about the look in her eyes when she quoted his own ruling back to him. It had been a look of pure, unwavering confidence. He remembered being young like that once. He remembered believing that the law was perfect, that if you just found the right words, justice would always win. But over the years, the paperwork and the politics had worn him down. He had stopped seeing people and started seeing case numbers. He had started assuming that he knew everything before he even heard the facts. And today, that arrogance had almost cost him his integrity. The prosecutor was sitting in the chair across from him, looking miserable. The young man held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "I checked the records, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice low. "She was right. The fence was there in '82. The survey confirms it. I missed it. I'm sorry." The judge turned away from the window and looked at the prosecutor. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to yell at the young man for not doing his job, for putting the court in a position to look foolish. But the judge knew he couldn't. He was the one in charge. He was the one who had tried to rush the case. He was the one who had mocked the girl instead of listening. "We both missed it," the judge said heavily. "I saw a child. I didn't see a lawyer. I didn't see a person with rights. I saw someone I could push around. That is on me, not you." "It won't happen again, sir," the prosecutor promised. "See that it doesn't," the judge said. "Because if you ever bring me a case based on assumptions again, I will hold you in contempt. Now, go." File the dismissal. The prosecutor stood up, looking relieved to be dismissed, and hurried out of the room. The judge turned back to the window. The girl down by the fountain had stood up. She shouldered her bag and started walking away, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. She was going back to her life, just a regular teenager again. But the judge knew he would never forget her. He walked over to a bookshelf in his office. It was filled with thick, dusty law books, just like the one the girl had carried. He pulled one out, an old volume of state statutes from the 1970s. He blew the dust off the cover. He hadn't opened this book in years. He usually just used the computer database for his research, relying on keywords and summaries. He sat down at his desk and opened the book. The smell of old paper filled his nose. He began to read, slowly, carefully. He was reading the laws as they were written, not how he thought they should be. For the first time in a long time, he was reading with the eyes of a student, looking for the truth, humble and hungry to learn. Back at her house, the girl unlocked the front door and dropped her bag on the floor. The house was quiet. Her dog came bounding down the hallway, tail wagging, happy to see her. She knelt down and buried her face in the dog's fur. Letting out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding all morning. "You would not believe the day I had, buddy," she whispered to the dog. He licked her cheek, unconcerned with zoning laws or court rulings. She stood up and walked to the kitchen window. Looking out into the backyard, she could see the fence. It was old, the wood a bit gray and weathered, but it was sturdy. It had stood there for decades, through rain and snow. It had been there before she was born, and it would be there long after she became a lawyer. It was just a fence. But today, it had been a symbol. It was the line she had drawn in the sand. She had told the world that she wouldn't be pushed around, that she knew her rights, and that she wasn't afraid to use her voice. She smiled as she watched a squirrel run along the top of the fence. The judge had called it a distraction. He had called her argument nonsense. But in the end, the law was the law, and she had been right. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The girl turned away from the window and headed to her room to start her homework. It felt good to be just a student again, but she knew that things had changed. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the next time someone underestimated her, they would be the ones to learn a lesson.